Hey, friends.
Hey, Joey.
Hi. Hey, all right, cool. So my name's Joey Goon, and people would probably know that if they were tuning into our social media channel right now, because I think it's streaming through my personal social media pages. So that would be a rhetorical statement. That's the first rhetorical statement that I've made today, and I might make a few more. But I am joined today by Shelly Metcalf and actually my cousin Dave Webb. And guys, please introduce yourselves. Shelly, if you want to start.
Yeah, sure. My name is Shelly Metcalf, and I'm based out of Vancouver, BC, Canada. And my background is in environmental science and clean energy engineering. And most of my professional work has been doing waste discharge permitting for the provincial government here in BC.
I guess I'm up. Cousin Dave. David. Hi, everybody. David Webb, St. Louis, Missouri. I currently teach at Washington University. I'm a lecturer in environmental studies. So I have a background in business and did some graduate work in sustainability. So what I do is I look at sustainability as it intersects with the realm of business and what organizations can do to be more sustainable. Also taking a look at our economic system and how that merges with sustainability and looking at those issues. So I teach undergraduate courses related to that at WashU.
Can you unpack sustainability for us a little bit? Like sustainability, we were talking about before we went live. Sustainability can be very nebulous, a little vague. What does sustainability mean to the two of you, and why do you think it's important that we're unpacking this today?
Sure.
If you want to go first.
Yeah. Okay. So sustainability. In fact, I teach a lot of classes that are introductory level sustainability, and it's a term that's actually it's gathered some traction over the last several years, and a lot of people define it in a lot of different ways. But what I like to do is, I like to step back to the dictionary and just kind of look at a real basic definition. And what I come to is sustain and able. It's the ability to keep going, the capacity to persist indefinitely into the future. So if you look at any system, whether it's you as a human being, as a society, or a global society, it's how can we keep going into the future? And you realize that any given system, an organism, a community, a city, state, nation, they have inputs, and those inputs come in. We do stuff with those resources or inputs, and we have outputs. We produce and we consume. And sustainability is how can we continue to do that, to live within the biophysical parameters of our planet, the resources that we rely on as humans to continue to live. And that's our businesses, that's our individual lives, that's our communities. So really just kind of a broad definition of what do we need to do to keep going without breaking the system. And I think that can be defined in terms of where we are right now. And a lot of the things that we see under the umbrella of sustainability, things like climate change, issues of that we see a lot in the news of famines, floods, droughts, all of these issues we're facing, looking at that as we've begun to push Earth systems a bit too far, and the Earth systems begin to push back. So realizing that we might be transcending those boundaries, those planetary boundaries that we need to live within. At the same time, understanding that everybody that lives on this planet needs to meet basic needs to survive. So how do we allow people to meet their basic needs, but do so within those boundaries, biophysical parameters of our planet?
That's a beautiful explanation.
Agreed. I don't think there's much more I could add to that. I think Dave really did a great job describing such a broad topic that covers a lot of areas. And don't think I could add any more to that definition. I guess yeah, go ahead, Joey.
No, please go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that because sustainability is such a big topic, I often go down to like the practical aspects of, okay, how do I handle such a big topic and big global ideas such as climate change and some of the things that Dave pointed out, which are happening, which we're seeing more, like wildfires are happening a lot more up here. I think they're happening in California more. Like, how do you deal with such a big topic in an individual day-to-day perspective in one person's life? And that's often like the connection I make about sustainability, is because you have these really big ideas, but what do I do about it? is often the question. And maybe that's the direction we can go today, is we can talk a bit about some practical mindsets or things that people can think about for how they could tackle the topic of sustainability.
We should absolutely go there right now. And actually, I'd love to bring in Lachlan for this, because Lachlan, you talked a moment ago about weaponizing apathy or weaponizing hopelessness, because it is such a broad topic. And I think people can stagnate or feel like we're all doomed anyway. So why, like, this is like bigger than me. So, if you want to maybe bring that question in, pose that question.
Sorry. I know you can't, if you're watching the live stream, see me on camera, kind of voice to God over here. We're down a camera today, so I'm off in the corner, but I've got a microphone.
But you sound amazing.
I do. I hope I sound amazing. I've done the tech right. I sound amazing. Yeah, no, but I'm 23, right? So I'm a little bit younger, and I know a lot of the mindset among my friends is like, it's tossed around jokingly, but it's like, the planet's doomed anyway. Like, why even have kids? Why bring kids into the world? Because everything's going to hell already. It's like, well, and to me, that's just such a bad mindset, because in a way, like the fossil fuel industry can weaponize hopelessness, where it's like they take your assumption that things are already going to hell and turn that into apathy, where you're no longer interested in taking action. You're no longer being proactive about trying to change things, trying to pass, sensible legislation, or get active in your community, or do whatever you see that as, being whatever things you see as being important, take part in. So, yeah, I think Joey's absolutely right. It would be good to start with talking about, what can people do? Like, are there things that everyday people just in their regular lives can be doing to help make a change? Are there policies they can support? Are there steps that they can take? Should they be advocating for recycling? Should they be buying less Starbucks? How important are plastic straws? These are things that a lot of people kind of feel lost about, I think, at least certainly, myself and people my age group tends to. So is there any advice you have in talking to that group of people and trying to reach out and combat some of that hopelessness that a lot of people feel?
Yeah, I think it's a really great point that you bring up. I mean, most of my students are in the neighborhood of 18 to 21. They're undergrads, and I get this all the time in class. People are, they're feeling hopeless. They're feeling scared. They feel like, like what does the future hold, and what can we really do when you're up against the fossil fuel companies that have millions or billions of dollars at their disposal. I like to point attention to things like the Sunrise Movement, Extinction Rebellion, Greta Thunberg, these activist type individuals, but also movements that are they're giving a voice to these issues that we haven't had before in the past. And those are so some of those are activistic movements, activism. And what I like to do, so I teach a class called Sustainable Business, and I like to have my students think of themselves as a business of one. And I ask them, so like, you as an individual running a business, can you actually make a difference? Can you really do anything? And honestly, the answer that we come to is no. You as an individual may not be able to have a huge impact, but in the aggregate, you can make change. And so if you start to think about changing your mindset individually, and I'm really big about shifting mindsets, about the way that we live on this planet, the resources that we produce and consume. And if you take that and you are a next generation leader, when you get into a position of power or into a business, then you have an opportunity to expand your voice, your mindset. And it may start off in a sort of a grassroots type of fashion, but then that can kind of coalesce into something bigger. I mean, ultimately, the generation of today will be taking over the reins of business, the reins of leadership. And if we can bring that critical awareness and education to the forefront now, then these are the individuals that will be mobilizing and galvanizing this type of stuff going forward. And I think we're starting to see that with where CEOs that are holding accountability for these sort of social, environmental type issues now. They're not able to get away with it anymore. And I think a lot of that is a lot of individual and youth movements that are saying, look, I don't want to work for a company that is exploiting the environment, that is exploiting people, that is not socially equitable, that propagates wealth or income inequality. And so if these businesses and these organizations want to hire and retain the best talent, they're going to have to start shifting the way that they operate. So I have some sense of, or inclination towards hope there. but it is a challenge.
Scaling hope.
Yeah, scaling hope.
I love that.
Exactly. Right.
Shelly, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I really like what Dave said here. Like, to the young people, like, you are the leaders of tomorrow. So absolutely, your reach and voice will expand, even if it feels very individual at the moment. So I absolutely totally resonated with what you said there. I guess some other things that I think about just in terms of how I live my life, because these are big topics again. It's hard to know how to make all these individual decisions, but for example, the 3 R's are a really good one in your everyday to sort of internalize. What can and there's an order to them. There's more than 3 R's, but reduce, reuse, and recycle are the pretty common ones that I think people know. And if you follow them in that order, that's a good principle for life. What can I reduce my consumption of? What can I reuse next? And then lastly, if I have to do something, reuse something, how can I recycle it? Like that's one of these principles I think everyone can follow. And again, the other thing I think about is money moves the world. So where I put my money, however much you have to spend, depending on where you are in your life and your disposable income, you can make choices whether you want to choose organic food or not, what kind of meat you want to buy, if you even want to eat meat. Like, you can make small choices every day in the things that you do in terms of what you consume regularly. I think the grocery store is a big one where you can choose where you put your money, can support how businesses are running. Are they sustainable? Do they care about the environment? You have a lot of power. And I think, to Dave's point, you may not feel like you have a lot of impact, but on the aggregate, when people make choices that way, I think it does have a big impact. And activism is also another way to do that. Governments, I think, play a really critical role in influencing where cost benefit economics doesn't necessarily take into account the environment. And so, also thinking about how your voice in combination with others to influence government at different levels that are make changes towards the world that you want to see in a more sustainable manner, I think also is important and can make a big change.
If I could give a shout out to a fellow Canadian of yours, Shelly, Bob Willard, who he runs a blog. He wrote Sustainability Advantage. He's been on the scene for a long time, and so you talked about sort of that the business and follow the money type angle, and this is something, and it's true, right? You follow the money, and money it greases the wheels. It fuels the world, and you kind of look at where some of this stuff is going right now, and when we talk about sometimes sustainability, we can talk about it from an inside out or an outside in. And this is Bob Willard's work in his recent blog that he wrote. So for the longest time, you had companies outside, sustainability being inside out. Hey, look at us, look at what we're doing. We're all this great marketing gloss around how we're being sustainable, how we're being environmentally friendly. And that's great. Companies doing the right thing and promoting themselves. But now what we're starting to see is somewhat of a tide shift with outside in. And this is a concept called ESG, environmental social governance. And this is very much about following the money. And we're talking about investors. And when we talk about ESG investing, there are savvy business people, financial people, who now recognize that things like climate change are a risk. So they don't want to put money into your business. They're not going to want to invest in a business that is at risk. And that could be a physical risk for things like climate change. So think about, hurricanes, fires, floods. Think about PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric out in California, the first on record climate bankruptcy. So those really brutal fires that happened, I can't remember the exact, I think it was around 2008, the Camp Fire, were traced back to PG&E that sparked those fires. And those fires were they ignited brush, and basically climate change and drier conditions made it ripe for flame, and their equipment ignited those fires. They went bankrupt. They declared bankruptcy because of that. So a physical risk of climate change and all of the related variables, now investors are saying, wait a minute, we don't want to invest in your company, or we're not going to provide you accessible capital like favorable interest rates or give you money to build your business if there are these risks. So we're starting to see that sort of tide shift in investing, and we'll have to see. It's still kind of young. It's not very well defined, but I think going forward, this ESG investing has the power to leverage finance to really help kind of move this along and make more of an impact in our business world.
Yeah. That's absolutely fascinating. How I guess from a pragmatic standpoint, I was just thinking about like, I guess it's more like, more practical, boiling it down to like green energy alternatives, this green energy initiative. People want to be more mindful about the choices that they make at the pump, and like maybe not funding these, these large conglomerate oil companies that are sort of monopolizing the energy industry. So we're all thinking about, okay, cool. What are little things that we can do maybe about the car that we drive, or putting solar on our homes, little things like that. Are these alternatives actually better, or do we have, I'm getting smiles out of Shelly. So like, are they actually better? Because I've heard that, lithium production is just as toxic to the environment as, fracking, or, moving gas through pipelines and oil spills and those other things. So, and by the way, if you can tell, I'm very ignorant on the topic, but I'm also very curious. And so what are these alternatives? I'll just leave it at that. Are these alternatives actually better for us and for the environment?
Shelly, you want to address it? You were smiling there. You get some thoughts on that?
I just think that for one, it's actually kind of a difficult question to answer when you do things like life cycle analysis, depending on where you draw the box. For example, I live in British Columbia. We have hydroelectric, which you could argue is cleaner than as some other types of energy production. But so, for example, here, yeah, if you want to look at purchasing an electric car, the electricity that's used to charge your car is coming from a greener source of electricity, versus in another jurisdiction where maybe they use coal or something else for power generation. Is it greener? I don't know. So that's why I was smiling, because it really gets a bit convoluted depending on where your electricity is coming from. And I think that's probably actually an area that would be good for everyone to get more aware of, is energy literacy, in terms of where does our electricity come from? Because we are in the world where we need electricity. So where does your electricity come from? How is it generated? Because that's a big question here, I think, for how we go into the future. Some people say, can we solve climate change without nuclear power? In the time frames of what we need to do within this century. And I'm not sure if we're the answer to that, but yeah, we do have a climate crisis. And I think I go back to like, just what can you do? I think generally just you have to make your choices based on the cost benefits that you can see. And I think inching towards moving into alternatives, renewables, is still a good idea. I mean, we're always going to have costs to the environment. So making sure you source where your materials are coming from. Are they following are you getting your materials from a place where there's pollution regulations, like things like this? Like, are the kinds of things you can think about to move into renewables, to try to think, am I still following a sustainable mindset, doing the best I can to be sustainable? You're not going to get this perfect, I think, is what I want to say, is like, there's no perfect answer to this. We just want to keep moving towards the best we can, and using the information that you can get access to make those decisions and your cost benefit considerations.
Yeah, that's such an important point there, that there is no perfect. I mean, it's a process, and to live, we have to consume, and consumption is destruction. We are going to destroy and degrade nature to a certain degree. The question is, can we bring that back into balance, to where we can live harmoniously within nature's biogeochemical cycles that have kept the earth going for billions of years. So, and what I mean by that is, can we take from the environment, but do so at a rate that doesn't overwhelm the environment's ability to regenerate and to renew itself? Yeah. And I know, Shelly, you mentioned you have some connection to waste. And so that's the other end of the equation. We've got our inputs that we pull from the environment. You mentioned, so we're looking at renewable technologies, right? Well, we need lithium for our batteries. That's a mineral that has to be mined from the earth. That's not free. There's a cost associated with that. So can we pool these things, these ecosystem services, our timber, our fish, our minerals, even our fossil fuels, do so and consume that at a rate that is not overwhelming the planet's ability to regenerate. Now, fossil fuels are not renewable, at least not in our timelines, in human timeframes. In geological time and deep time, yes, fossil fuels would be renewable. So can we consume renewable resources at a rate that does not exceed their ability to regenerate? At the same time, nothing is benign. When we consume something, there is a waste associated with it. So if we're putting that waste back into the environment, are we overwhelming the planet's ability to absorb and process that waste? So we need to start thinking more in a more circular fashion. So you may hear phrases out there like the circular economy or circularity or industrial ecology. So what we need to learn to do is emulate nature. And in nature, waste equals food. So nature is very good at, so a plant or a tree dies, it falls to the forest floor. You have your decomposers that break it down. It becomes nutrients into the soil. Ultimately, it becomes another tree. So can we emulate these circular processes so that we can learn to use alternative renewable energy to extract resources from nature, design our products and services in such a way that they are less harmful? And so say we build a laptop. If we're smart about the design, can we design that laptop to, at the end of its life, be broken down and recirculated into a technological metabolism? Can we build or design clothing or other products so that when we are finished with them and we quote unquote throw them away, they decompose and they go back into an organic nutrient cycle? Because there is no such thing as a way. And I think particularly in Western nations, in industrialized and developed nations, we have this notion of, oh yeah, when we're done with it, we just throw it away. But it always goes somewhere. And that somewhere, by and large, a lot of that has been exporting our waste to other countries. So it's out of sight, out of mind, not in my backyard, but it's in somebody's backyard. Electronic waste is a huge example of that. We export that to countries up until recently. Countries like China would take our electronic waste. And then you see all these really graphic images of children sorting through this really harmful, toxic electronic waste to separate out the valuable materials like the gold and various metals and stuff like that. So we have to kind of get away from this take, make, waste linear economic system.
Yeah.
And do something that's more circular to emulate nature. So biomimicry, nature cycles, and things like that.
It may not be directly relevant, but how optimistic are you guys about new technologies like carbon capture and stuff that might help push us towards something that's a little bit more circular and cyclical?
Yeah, Shelly,
just asking as you guys who are more experts on it than I am. You hear it brought up and discussed, but I'd love to get your guys' just opinions on what you think about that and how large a role it could play in helping be a solution to climate change, stuff like that.
I'm not super up on where we're at with that. I think there are a number of technologies out there, and I think there are companies that are trying to either build them or have built them. I don't know how mainstream they are. I think we are at the point where we need to look at removing some of the carbon from the atmosphere, not just reducing how much we put into the atmosphere. So I think those kinds of technologies and figuring out how those work and how they can be useful in our economy are going to be really important in the next couple of decades for sure.
Yeah, I would underscore that. So I think, you could turn off the tap right now on carbon dioxide emissions. Carbon dioxide is the most common one, right? We produce so much of it, but it's going to remain in the atmosphere. It's going to have an effect. So I think we're sort of beyond that point where we can just say, okay, reduce emissions and we'll be okay. We're going to have to start looking into what sometimes are called negative emissions technology. So how are we going to pull out this legacy carbon that's in the atmosphere? How are we going to pull it out and process it? And there's a lot of technologies. You mentioned direct capture, carbon sequestration. There are, whether it's planting 1 trillion trees or building these, industrial plants that literally have fans that pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then they sequester it underground. I think the problem, what we want to be careful with is this starts getting into territory of geoengineering. And I think we are an amazingly adaptive, resourceful species. And technology has been a boon for civilization, no doubt about it. I think what I always like to warn about is that technology is not a silver bullet or a guarantee. So yes, we will absolutely need technology to help us pull carbon out of the atmosphere, to either sequester it, or even better, to use carbon as a feedstock into our products that we make. And there are companies out there that are sequestering carbon into products that they make. And I mean, the classic example is if you drink a soda is carbonated. That's CO2. So you could actually take CO2 waste from one area, and you can then make it a feedstock and input into another area. But we need to be careful. And I think this is where I get into really unpopular territory of degrowth. Shelly, I don't know how much of this comes up in sort of the waste and engineering, environmental sciences landscapes that you work with, but this concept of degrowth is something we talk about in economics a lot. We have this mindset of infinite economic expansion. If we just grow, that will solve all of our problems. So GDP, gross domestic product, as long as that's always going
We
up,
talked about that just a minute ago.
then everybody says, hey, we're great. But newsflash, on a finite planet, which our planet is, it's impossible. It violates the laws of thermodynamics. You can't do it.
Yeah.
And it's politically unpopular. It's political suicide to come in and say, oh, I'm a president that's going to run on a platform of enough. It's always got to be about growth.
More.
Yeah.
We talked about that at lunch the other day too. It's like, in a materialistic world, we don't know how to metabolize life, so we try to control. And we're told from a young age that the best way to control your life is to become successful. And so we always define success. We're sold this narrative downstream that's like, hey, you're successful when you accumulate things. Like the more things you accumulate, the more successful you are. So like we all have this lifestyle where we're trying to accumulate the 3-car garage, the white picket fence, the beautiful home, the amazing family, 3 kids. And then we accumulate all these things. And we're like, wait a second, society told me, my company told me, my boss told me, my mom told me, my school teachers told me, everybody told me that when I'd had all these things that I'd be successful and I'd be happy. And we get sold this trick. And then if we're lucky enough at 65 or 90 years old, we wake up from this trick and we're like, damn, I wish I would have done all these things differently in my life. And like perhaps success is more about harmony and balance, and that our overconsumption as consumers and this desire to reach this proverbial definition of whatever success might be, this mountaintop that we're trying to strive for, is all bullshit and it's all a trick. And that harmony and balance is really what success is in life. So can we unpack that a little bit more? Like, is success about personal fulfillment, or is success personal action?
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot there. Shelly, did you have any thoughts? I don't want to.
I'm just thinking, I think I heard there's some research that after a certain amount of money, like people don't get more happy. Like,
75,000.
75,000.
yeah, 75,000.
Yeah,
there's something to it.
I mean, with
There's
inflation at 8.5%, it's more like 100 and 100 something, 150.
Probably,
Yeah. But there is validity to that, I'm sure.
I think we've been sold a bill of goods to a certain extent. I've heard it. There's some books out there. I've heard people call it affluenza. So like, the acquisitiveness, acquiring things has become maladaptive in our evolutionary trajectory. So there was a time, back on the savannah when we were, tribes and we were evolving like early hominids and whatnot, acquiring stuff made sense. Like you needed stuff to live and survive. Although if you were in a hunter-gatherer society, acquiring stuff actually was not advantageous because you had to move around. But there was a time though when we lived in a full world. So nature was abundant relative to people. And so it just seemed like, we can acquire more stuff. And that, there was some sort of advantage to that. But I think that has become maladaptive as we get into in modern times where we just have so much stuff. And so now what's becoming scarce is nature. The inputs, the resources are becoming scarce. The built environment is becoming prolific and at great expense to ecosystems and ecosystem services. But yet we live in a society where we're sold this sort of bill of goods that like, if you are not keeping up with the Joneses, you're failing.
Yeah.
You're on a hedonic treadmill. So you're constantly, you're working 60, 70, 80 hours a week to get the paycheck, to buy the stuff that you don't even have time to use. And then like you're wondering, you're like chasing this like black hole of happiness, and you're trying to fill it with stuff, and it just doesn't get you there as much as like if you can get used to this concept of enough, but forge more meaningful relationships and experiences. And I think some of the research you're talking about, like above a certain amount, and it was $75,000, I think, in this study, saying beyond that, it's just it's like the law of diminishing returns.
Sure.
Each additional increment of stuff doesn't make you that much more happy. It's more like the experiences, that the happiness that you have sharing time with family and doing things and that type of stuff that gets to that fulfillment that you're talking about.
That's really inspiring. I think that's really motivating. I love that perspective. I think you're totally right. Totally agree with everything you said. I think it's great. I just got captivated listening to you.
And just because I wanted to look this up and actually know what the Webster's definition of hedonism is, it's the psychological or motivational hedonism claims that human behavior is determined by desires to increase pleasure and decrease pain. So the more we accumulate, the less pain we have. Is that kind of what hedonism is in a sense?
Well, I want to, I have a background in philosophy, and I do want to say that there's an argument around hedonism where some people say that to do hedonism right, it's actually like, people have this perception of hedonism as like, oh my God, do as many drugs as possible, like, feel as good as you can at any given time, like that is hedonism. But there's a counter argument to that where it's like, well, that's really, you're cutting yourself off from a lot of future happiness if you ruin your life now, if you ruin the planet now. So there's kind of this argument that like, okay, maybe hedonism really should be the idea that it's like the most amount of happiness for the longest period of time is more valuable than, more excitement right now. That perhaps like contentment, this idea that like we are good and we are going to enjoy a really full, long life is like the truest form of hedonism. So there's some back and forth there over what hedonism really means. Not that that's the direction you were going for, but
so then how do we then as a humanity, as individuals that are having this conversation, we obviously believe it's important, how do we have sustained happiness besides maybe doing mushrooms once a month?
Yeah,
I mean, we could all do psilocybin together once a month, and
Joey's out here advocating natural medicine again.
I mean, plant medicine. By the way, this is not a recommendation to go and try psilocybin. Absolutely do not do that. Consult your doctor, your shaman, or your personal life coach.
Do not try this at home, kids.
Yeah,
Squeegee your third eye.
18 plus right here. Yeah.
Sustain. Yeah. How do we sustain happiness? Like, what does it take to sustain happiness and to reach that level of excellence and mastery that everybody wants to attain in their life without putting a negative or a toxic, sort of thumbprint or footprint on into the planet?
Wow, you're asking the million dollar questions here. Yeah, how to attain happiness. There's so many researchers that are far smarter than I am. Daniel Pink, I think it was talking about finding happiness or fulfillment in your work, and he talked about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And you just used a couple of those phrases, as opposed to being coerced into showing up at a job and punching a clock. But if you have some level of individual control, autonomy, and you can master a skill, and you have a purpose-driven job, there's ways that you can get happiness there that extend beyond a paycheck, that allows you just to buy more stuff. But I mean, it's tough. I think that sort of accumulation of stuff, that affluenza, is sort of ingrained, particularly into Western cultures. So I think there's a lot of reconditioning that needs to happen. I think I don't know if any of you saw, this is probably several years ago now, some documentaries came out on Netflix about minimalism. It was pretty popular, and there's two individuals, I can't think of their names right now, they wrote a book on minimalism, and it's this whole movement that kind of coalesced or coincided with the tiny house movement, which also some interesting documentaries out there on that. But this idea of less is more, and I think once you start to realize that if you buy just a handful of things that enable experiences and enable relationships, that you start to realize that has actually more longevity than just the sort of the temporal, the fleeting, consumeristic treadmill. How do they find happiness in Canada? I think Canada's happier than the U.S. in general, aren't you? I mean, it seems like Canada's a happier place. Yeah, that's how we see it.
I was trying to look up that book, and there's so many books on minimalism that I won't even try and mention, but I was trying to look it up so we could reference it. But Shelly, please jump in.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing. Happiness, like it seems to become an inside job at this point, about redefining a sense of your own purpose, and where you derive, I guess, value and satisfaction from. And I think there can be ties to sustainability. Like I think the circular economy, when you look at it, it does look at things more locally, and reducing, reusing. These things seem to have a more local effect, which I think turns out to be more of a community effect, perhaps. I don't know if I'm right in that or not, but I kind of imagine it to be that way. And I think ultimately, that question brings us back to like human spirit, connecting with one another. And I think somehow there's something about that to me that seems to take us off this linear consumption of input, output, consume as much as possible, be successful. Like it somehow takes us back to something of the heart of the human spirit. And I think connecting to one another. And I think somehow that does something too about connecting us to sustainability and a different type of economics, business models, thinking differently, different viewpoints and perspectives that I think exist. They're here. We all know groups and people and our friends that we talk to that have different mindsets than what might have been sold to us as this bill of goods, mainstream ideas that still seem to perhaps dominate some of our main economic markets. But they're there. These alternatives are there, and we can again choose what we want to support in what we talk about, how we think, where we put our money. We do have power there.
I was trying to pull up this other book that I recently read that is very similar to sort of these the common themes, and pulling in the common thread is that happiness and finding success in life really is that internal journey. And one of the books is Shelly, you actually might be familiar with Hal Elrod, but his book, The Miracle Morning, really changed my life. It's in his philosophy is how you start your day is how you do everything. And so what my wife and I have been doing is the miracle morning practice every single morning. So I write down, we write down what we're grateful for, 5 things that we're grateful for, 5 things that we're going to do throughout the day to help bring that gratitude, to and with and from and through other people. We do verbal affirmations. We sit in silence and we meditate and just breathe and feel your heart beating and just just get out of your head and into your heart, get out of the thinking mind and just sit there and feel your heartbeat and just feel that presence. And, we exercise in the morning, we tell each other why we love each other, and just like those little interactions and spending 10 to 15 minutes of presence together, doing that in the morning, that radiates, and that, we're able to then bring that type of energy into the interactions that we have with people in our daily interactions. And that manifests in so many different ways, whether it's just letting that person in front of me, cut in traffic when they're trying to yield, or buying Starbucks for the person behind me, or, we're going through this process right now where we're building, we're building a home, and the builders that are out there working tirelessly on our house to build this, this beautiful home of ours where we're eventually going to raise our family. Like we delivered, bring lunch to them, and we love on these people. And so I think, like you said, it's a personal journey, but it's also like, how do we then take that personal journey and build it inward so that we can go outward? Because the more we scale inward, the more we can then love on other people around us. And I just think that that's a beautiful thing. If we can all just be nicer and stop comparing ourselves and looking at comparison is the thief of joy. So I think we just need to look at all the beautiful things that are happening in our lives. And if you're in a career or you're doing something that you hate, get out of it. Life is finite. And we're talking about sustainability and how we can all be more thoughtful in the planet. And I think it really starts by doing with something that you love, because when you love the thing that you're doing on a daily basis, you're going to be more happy to the people around you. And you're going to, want to bring other people along that journey with you of happiness and positive energy and optimism and joy.
Would you say comparison is the thief of joy? Was that the phrase you just used?
Comparison is a thief of joy. Yeah. And you know what? And I share that we're building a house, and somebody might be on here being like, well, he's bragging about building a house. No, you're comparing. If that's something that you want to do, then go out there and do it. Right. And And so I say comparison is the thief of joy, and that it's very easy for us to look at other people and be like, well, look at all the things that they have that I don't have. Well, like, you're just robbing yourself of joy in that moment. And so if you want that thing, then set it up as an intention and go out there and freaking get it. Like, you can get whatever you want in life. You just have to stop comparing yourself to other people, because there's always going to be people ahead of you. But then I also look at, I mean, we're having a conversation around materialism and sustainability. And so there's a balance. There's a really delicate balance, to make sure that you're not always comparing yourself in the sense of material things.
I've heard the phrase, so you're probably familiar with the phrase fear of missing out.
Yeah.
And I feel like that sort of defines a lot of our society today, because
Mhm.
I mean, everything is so accessible, right? You literally have the world at your fingertips, and we've got so many resources, and we can access so much stuff. And there's this fear of missing out, like you're not doing everything at all times and keeping up with the Joneses, and you're always comparing yourself. But there's the converse of that. If you think you call it the joy of missing out. Not my phrase. I can't recall where I came across it, but the idea of the joy of missing out is you pick a few things, and you own those decisions, and you relish those decisions, and you just really immerse yourself in the moment of whatever it is you choose to focus on and do, as opposed to what effectively becomes the paradox of choice. If you've got so much choice, it almost becomes paralyzing.
Yeah.
Whereas if you just own a few things and do them well and do them mindfully, I think that kind of gets into this. Like you hear a lot about mindful meditation today as a very popular. There's all kinds of apps out there around mindfulness, and I think for a reason, right? Is like slow down, get off that hedonic treadmill.
Yeah.
Take these few things, really savor these moments, these relationships, and the things that you're doing, and really be in the moment, be present in that moment, and allow it to unfold. It's not easy, right? I mean, we're conditioned by the society we live in, and it requires effort. You've got a regimen now you talked about, but I think once you start to do that, you start to habituate these new behaviors, and before you know it, you start feeling better.
So true. When you talk about mindfulness, there's a YouTube channel, a gentleman, his name is Travis Elliott. And for anybody listening, or, even for you, Dave, Shelly, Lachlan, if you guys are interested in learning more about yoga, or are you all into yoga? You practice mindfulness on a daily, weekly basis?
It could be more regular for sure, but I love it. Yeah.
I feel the same way. Shelly, how about you?
Yeah, I try to do yoga fairly regularly.
No, I don't do yoga. Sorry.
So Travis Elliott, he has this whole, like the more you kind of lean into, he talks about, like your hips and your shoulders are the two most important joints in your body, because they carry the most energy, but they also have the opportunity to hold the most energy and constrict you, because they are the largest joints and the largest bones in your body. And so he talks about the more you lean into that pain on the yoga mat. If you've ever been like in a stretch position in the yoga mat and you're like sweating and you're trying to hold it, and you're like, oh, you're dealing with balance, and like all these different sort of, feelings are running through you, these energies are running through you simultaneously as you hold that position. And he's like coaching you through, and he's like, the more you can lean into that hip, the more pain you can feel, the more opportunities awaiting you on the other side of that pain. And then that can sort of carry itself into your life, because your yoga practice, your mindfulness practice, you might be doing that today, on the mat, but tomorrow it might be a challenging situation, and you just relate back to that mindfulness practice. And the more that you can lean into pain on the mat, or that discomfort, or that new practice, or that new thing that you're trying to do, whatever that new thing might be, the more you can then apply that into your life circumstances and situations. And you're like, well, this really seems, yesterday it seemed insurmountable, but today, because I was able to, is this making sense?
It does. It
Okay.
does make
Yeah.
sense. I meant,
Mhm.
I think it relates perfectly back to the topic that we're talking about with sustainability, because I think you're talking about some level of resilience here. Where
Thank you.
you're
That was the
building
word that I was looking for. And I was
Yeah, it's great with individual resilience. So you're
Yeah.
training yourself for other moments to be adaptable and flexible. And I mean, I think we can just build that up to our, systemically, like resilience in a system is the ability for that system to withstand a shock. And that relies on a lot of different things in nature. That is reliant on biodiversity, a biodiverse system that is like a rich ecosystem, a tapestry of flora and fauna that come together, make that a more stable system, able to withstand a shock. And think of it this way, to stick with the environmental dimension we've been going on, think of our current industrial agricultural system. So we grow foods and we grow monocultures. We'd use in high intensity technology, fertilizers, things like nitrogen and phosphorus to grow monocultural crops. And what I mean by that is a single crop. So you're focusing on like wheat or soy, for example, two very popular ones, or corn, maize. But a monoculture is not as resilient. So if you've got a single crop and perhaps think of a particular pest or a disease, a mold, a fungus or something, destroys that crop is gone now. Whereas in nature, natural systems are more biodiverse, and therefore, if one is in decline, another might be, ascendant, and you just have a stronger, more resilient system that can withstand shocks, whatever those shocks may be. And I think that is kind of interesting because it applies at an individual level as well.
Yeah.
Diversifying your own practice, be that mindfulness, be that yoga, exercise, diversity in general, just exposing yourself to other cultures and other people, other ways of thinking and ways of life. It makes you a more well-rounded and holistic individual.
Absolutely. And the more resilience we have in our lives, the more we can become a candle flame unaffected by the winds of change.
Wow. Yeah. Period. Full stop.
What else did we not unpack? I feel like we've been through an incredible amount in 45 minutes. What are things that you all wanted to talk about that we haven't touched on yet, or questions that perhaps I haven't asked that are on your head and your heart that you feel called to share?
Nothing for me. I don't know why you're all looking this way.
I was just seeing if there was anything that you wanted to, chime in on, or we could go to like a rapid fire. You're so good at those questions.
I'm good at it because I prepared them ahead of time. I didn't this time around.
But maybe off the cuff could be more fun.
Improv.
God, you got to help me out if we're doing that. We got to both be thinking and passing back some questions.
Okay.
But I do like that idea. Let me look up some questions.
Okay. Shelly, favorite book?
Ooh. Right now it's Smart Women Love Money. It's about women investing in the financial sector, actually.
Okay. Nice.
Yeah.
How about you, Dave?
I want to just give a pitch for the book that I teach.
Yeah.
Because it's relevant to the conversation. So I teach ecological economics, and I want to give a shout out to Kate Rayworth, who she wrote a book. It's popular press, so it's not a dense economics textbook. It's called Donut Economics. I think everybody should read it, and I think it's great because Kate, and it's important that it's she bringing a feminist perspective to what has traditionally been a white male-dominated discipline of economics.
Yeah.
And she takes economics and she turns it on its head, and she said, we need to think about this. So getting back to diversity, she's like, we need ecological and environmental and feminist and all these different perspectives on our economic system. And it's amazing. It's such a great book, and it's why I chose to use it as the text in my class, because it's approachable. It's an easy read, and what it really gets to is talking about these core issues of, hey, look, balance. Like, how do we allow for everybody on this planet to be able to meet their needs? So you may have heard of something called the Sustainable Development Goals. It's the United Nations. They followed the Millennium Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals is probably the closest thing we have as a blueprint to build a resilient and sustainable society. So it's things like, eradicating hunger, eradicating disease, no poverty, educating women and children, particularly in developing nations where they don't have these opportunities to partake in the economy. So there's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And Kate lines those out, and she calls it the donut. There's an inner circle of the donut and an outer circle. The inner circle are this social floor. So everybody needs to be able to meet their basic needs: food, water, shelter, partake in the economy. But as we do that and we begin to generate income and to be able to buy things to consume, we have to be aware of that outer ring of the donut. That's our planetary boundaries, our ceiling. So we can't traverse things like, with like climate change. We can't put too much CO2 into the atmosphere. We have to watch out for things like phosphorus and nitrogen runoff, fertilizers that are causing dead zones and marine hypoxia and things like that. So what you end up with is this really great picture of how do we run or fundamentally re-engineer our economy so that we stay within Earth's capacity to provide, to regenerate, and we make sure that nobody's left behind, so that we're in that sort of sweet spot. And I just love this book. I can't recommend it enough. I think every economist should have to read that. Every person, I think, could benefit from it. So, yeah. So a shout out to Kate Rayworth.
That was an amazing testimony for her book, and I plan, as soon as we're finished with this recording, to go and order it on Amazon. Sounds absolutely fascinating.
One related one, another person that I really have been following his work and is Jason Hickel. Hickel, am I getting that right? Sorry, Jason, if I'm not you're probably not listening, Jason. But he wrote a book called Less is More. And so this whole idea of getting really sort of used to this concept of enough, and realizing that just because we're not constantly consuming more, growing, which is impossible. Infinite physical expansion is impossible on a finite planet. So how do we get used to this concept of enough? And less doesn't mean austerity. You can still have a very fulfilling and enriching life if you're consuming the right things in balance. And so these are just the books that are really sort of on my radar right now that I recommend far and wide. Yeah.
Sorry, you have your rapid fire questions ready to go? I mean, but
even still, I've loved the conversations we're having.
I was gonna say, I mean, there are so many things that we can like unpack from what he just said, and I mean, we could go that direction too. There's so much. Like and from our earlier conversation, all right, two options. We can talk about what we should be reducing, because Shelly, you mentioned that earlier, and that was a question that I thought was actually a really interesting one that we could explore. So like, what can an individual, what should we be reducing, and what are more mindful choices that we could perhaps be making at the grocery store? Even you talked about, not eating meats, perhaps looking at more organic food, vegetables, those types of things. We could go that route, or we could talk about, Dave, what you just shared. And you talked a little bit about, less is more, and that resources are perhaps scarce, and this degrowth methodology and model could actually be, a catalyst for not reversing, our
mitigating.
Thank you. Yes, mitigating everything that we're currently doing on the planet in terms of making a more sustainable planet. So those are two different directions we can go right now. Which direction should we head? Maybe we could tie them into one.
I think they're related.
Okay, perfect.
I think they are too.
Great, let's do it. So what could we be reducing? What should we be reducing? On your acronym, the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. What should we reduce?
Consumption and energy use, really. So your consumption of anything material and how much energy you use. That's what you can reduce. Any way you can do that. So that could be, for example, how you can turn down the thermostat in the winter, and dress in a sweater, or figure out other ways to cool yourself in the summer. So you're not using air conditioning if you're in a place that needs to have air conditioning. Can you use warm or cold water to launder your clothes? I mean, these are all things that reduce the amount of energy that you might use day to day. And then there's other things like how you get around, how you choose what transportation modes you choose to use. When you go to the grocery store, do you have to grab a plastic bag to put your vegetables in it? Or can you just put it in your basket and take it to the checkout? These kinds of things are simple, small things that you can do to reduce how many things you bring into your house. And you can always look at how much you're having to recycle, or how much garbage you produce every week, or however often your collection pickup is. And you can try to think of how could I reduce how much is going into those containers, because that's sort of a quantifiable way that you can visualize what you are personally consuming, something that's inputting into your life day to day. And so you can use that and go, okay, I'm bringing this much plastic. Is there any way in my purchasing choices or choices I've got that I can reduce how much plastic I'm having to recycle? And therefore, by choosing something else, you're not putting that demand on the economic system to produce that plastic for that thing. So those are some examples that you could do to reduce in your day to day.
Reducing our outputs.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I think as Shelly said, reducing consumption, reducing energy use. But and what I would say there too, in this will, if we want to tie this back to where we started earlier with individuals kind of losing hope and apathy, there's solid reason why people could become apathetic here. Because one, recycling doesn't really work.
Right now.
Yeah.
So okay, everybody, please keep recycling, but we also need to keep in mind that we need to fundamentally change systems. So like the recycling infrastructure as it's set up, the statistic is something like only 9% of all plastics ever produced have been recycled. And here's where we start then tying into, and this gets a bit cynical, but it's also backed by plenty of evidence that, corporations that have been well entrenched and have made a lot of money with business as usual, status quo, and that sort of take, make, waste sort of linear economy, they have vested interest in maintaining the status quo because it's profitable. So there is a tendency, well, not a tendency, this has happened. Like big corporations will put the onus on the individual. So big corporation, and I won't call out any by name, but we have millions and millions and millions of dollars in research and development funds. But instead of us spending that money to maybe produce less plastic or find an alternative to plastic altogether, no, we don't want to do that because that represents a cost to our company that eats into our bottom line, and then it's not as profitable for our shareholders. We want to maintain profitability. So what we're going to do, big profitable company, is put the onus on you, Joey. You're the problem because you're not recycling enough. So, and the same thing, this campaign goes back to litter. It goes back to when we had recyclable glass bottles. So it is more cost effective for a major beverage producer to use virgin materials, create virgin glass bottles, virgin plastic bottles, than it is for them to recycle those. That represents a cost. So it was better for them if they created single use and you throw it away and then you buy a new one. Now, we need to change that system so that recycling is more effective, so that these organizations are actually held accountable to take back their products that are harmful for the environment, to put those back into a circular economy. But without that infrastructure in place, it's not going to happen. Us as individuals are somewhat limited with what we can do in the system that we have.
Yeah.
That's why we need to come together in grassroots efforts. We need to advocate for policy change. It has to be codified at a policy level. If we don't get it ingrained in our legislature, in our regulations, and our laws, then that change is going to be slow to non-existent, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm infinitely glad you brought that up. I didn't want to push the conversation into a political angle that you guys didn't feel comfortable with, but that's exactly what's been running through my head. Is I know a lot of people my age are pretty aware of the fact that most all pollution is caused by corporations, and it feels very like, like we're being talked down to be like, what you need to do to save the planet is to use less plastic bags, is to do this. It's like, yes, all those things are good, but like that's not going to fix it. It's not going to cut it. It's not enough. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I think that's an important part of the conversation that is often left out. It's like these are systemic changes that need to happen fundamentally. And there has been an effort to kind of offload the guilt of corporations onto the everyday person because that's easier and cheaper. And so, yeah.
That's very true. But I mean, corporations increasingly are being held accountable now. We talked about ESG, so investors that are looking at, I want to put my money in a company that's not at risk. So I talked about physical risk, but there's also transitional risk. Physical risk is your company's going to go away because like a hurricane's going to blow down your cell phone towers, or whatever it is the business. You run a theme park and it's 150 degrees outside. Well, you're not going to get a whole lot of tourists coming to your theme park. Floods, fires, what have you. That's a physical risk to your business. Transitional risk, you've been running your business on a fossil fuel economy. And fossil fuels are finite. Fossil fuels cause emissions that are causing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that cause climate change. So we must transition to cleaner, renewable energies. So there's a transitional risk there that you can't run your company business as usual. So investors are going to start increasingly putting their money in backing capital investments for companies that are thinking about doing the right thing, that are going to be sustainable as a company, meaning they will continue to go on in the future because they're doing these quote unquote right things. So I think, a lot of the pressures there, as well as just companies realizing that to be sustainable, like they themselves will need to shift if they want to continue to stay in business.
Who are these companies that are pioneering these green initiatives? Like the companies that we should, as individual consumers, be supporting.
Wow. Do you have a list at the ready, Shelly?
I'm just wondering, like, is there one company in particular that really stands out to you as a company that's sort of pioneering this new, like, innovative initiative?
For a clothing company, I mean, just one that comes to mind, like Patagonia, for example, like they have a lot of sustainability practices, and are they perfect? I don't know, but certainly you can look for things like that where companies advertise and talk about their sustainability practices. I think also you can look for companies that are B Corp. I think that's where they're, that's like a label that you can apply for that. I don't know it entirely, but I think their purpose or their mission isn't just profit, and they've been verified to be that way. So that's something. And I know in Canada we've even got a label called EcoCert. So I think it's where you can purchase a product that it's got the minimal number of things needed for the product to do what it needs to do. So it doesn't have additives or other things that aren't unnecessary for that product to perform its function. So you can simplify the amount of things that are in a product. So there's different labels that you can also look in addition to specific companies that you can use in your purchase decisions.
That's a really good point. I mean, you brought up B Corp. I think
I've never heard
B
of
Corp
that.
is great. So it stands for Benefit Corporation. It's like the way that you incorporate your company. You are legally obligated to not just produce returns for your shareholders. So when we talk about shareholders, stockholders, they're the financial investors in your company. Mm-hmm. So this is expanding that circle to you must provide value for your stakeholders. So stakeholders, you move beyond just your investors and you start talking about, well, who's a stakeholder? My employees, the community in which I do business, the environment itself. So there's realizing that a company, its operations impacts many people.
Many people.
Yeah.
Sure.
So you want to be taking care of all of those. And when you're certified as a B Corp, and it's not easy to do, there's hundreds of criteria that you need to meet. So you go through and you have to fill out this form, and you have to basically dissect your company, really be open and transparent about how you're doing business. Then you're evaluated. And if you become a B Corp, it says basically like a certification. We are performing along all of these different dimensions. Then that allows us as consumers to feel a little bit more comfortable, like, oh, I want to do business with this company because I know that they're a B Corp. They've done the work. They're doing the work. So they're a company that you can feel good about supporting. That also ties in with this ESG thing again. I've talked about it multiple times, but environmental social governance, more and more, you've got reporting frameworks out there that are coalescing. So a lot of them, like the Global Reporting Initiative, there's been a whole bunch of consolidation around like the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, there's a whole bunch of different sort of reporting and metrics organizations that are now starting to consolidate. And what we want to start pushing for and what we're getting closer to is, well, you're a finance guy, Joey, you have a background in finance. If you were selling a stock or you wanted to buy a public company, you would look at their disclosures, right? You would probably look at SEC, you would look at their reports, their annual reports, but also their
financial statements.
Pro forma financial statement. Like no investor in their right mind is going to just invest a lot of money in a company without looking at those performance statements. For the longest time, we haven't had that equivalent for sustainability or environmental performance.
That's such a good point.
So now we're getting there. And the SEC is now having the conversation about making this mandatory around climate change, to where companies will have to mandatorily, they will be mandated.
It's a word for the sake of this podcast.
Okay, mandatorily, kids. Those at home, they'll have to disclose what their climate risks are, so that investors can make more informed decisions. So this is really just,
that's remarkable.
I mean, it's great, right? Because it's not just the tree hugging thing, right? It's not like, oh, I love the environment and it's green and it's like hippy dippy, right? It's like, no,
dude,
it's becoming more mandated.
And how do we make it less of an us versus them thing? it's so much been like, if you're a Republican, you're not, and we don't have to go super political, but it's like, I think one party pushes more for, green climate initiative. Another party pushes more for profitability and sustainability, and, more in companies. How can we make it not an us versus them thing and more of like a human responsibility thing?
Yeah, generational shifts, I think, will be part of that. And the problem is we're running out of time. Clock's ticking, right? The damage is being done, and we need to act quickly. So I think each new generation seems to be a little bit more, more in tune or open to these ideas. But I mean, ultimately, we need things like we need policy. So you talk about like businesses, Citizens United, the famous Supreme Court case that effectively ruled that a business, there's no limit on campaign contributions that a business can provide. So my vote as an individual has got nothing against a company that can mobilize a PAC or a super PAC and millions of dollars to influence policy. They're just far more powerful. And until we get that sort of money out of politics, we have some sort of separation there. That's a tough road to hoe. I mean, do you hoe a road? A tough field to hoe?
Yeah.
I've never hoed anything except myself. Maybe. Sorry.
Hoe yourself out.
PG-13. Yeah.
Shelly, anything to add on that? Thoughts that you want to?
We're talking about like basically conflict in some ways. So I say be curious. Anytime you have a conversation with somebody where your perspective is different, be curious. Because climate change is difficult because you have a global problem that's got localized acute costs.
Yeah.
And so like in Canada, you've got Alberta, which produces the most oil and gas for the whole country. So as a country, we want to achieve a climate target. The costs are borne by Albertans primarily for that economic shift. And that makes it difficult. And so I think having understanding, but also being curious and doing our best to work with people and understand that the costs are borne differently to try to make this change will help put ourselves in a position of less us versus them.
For sure. I love that position of like always growing, ever curious, almost like, being an empath. I heard this once, but someone said empathetic witness to other people's perspectives. So you're just sitting there holding space for them, as because I think over the last couple of years we can all agree that politics has become a lot more polarizing. So how can we just sit there and like just understand and be empathetic to other people's perspectives and based on their own reference of the world.
That is important. Meeting people where they are, being able to speak the language, knowing your audience, and you bringing up Canada. You talked about Albertans maybe being burdened by costs, and I'm reminded of I think it's British Columbia was the province that this is going back to 2015, but the province of British Columbia enacted basically what's called a revenue neutral tax. So what they did is they tax fossil fuels. So if you're producing a certain amount, if your business is producing a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide or what have you, you have to pay a tax. Now, in the United States, politically, tax is a really bad word. You say tax and people, they just get their hackles up, particularly on, certain sides of the aisle. When you talk about that, and it's true because you can harm people. Like if you put a tax on gasoline here and the price of gasoline goes to $10 a gallon, there's a whole lot of people now that are hurt by that. They can't fill up their car. They can't get to work. They can't feed their families. If you do what British Columbia province did, they did this revenue neutral tax. It's a tax that's paired with a dividend. So you raise the taxes on the bads, the things that you don't want. So if you're producing harmful carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and increasing global warming, you get taxed for that bad behavior that we don't want. That money then comes into the government coffers. And what they did in British Columbia is they distributed a dividend to every single person that lived in that province. So you got a check. So if that company increased the price of their product, or they increased the price of a gallon or liter, whatever it is in every other nation in the world that is on the metric system except for us. So if you increase the price of the cost of goods and services, people that could not otherwise afford that would be able to because they got a dividend. So you can talk about things like tax shifting too. What if we didn't tax income? Because income's good, right? We want people to work, to be productive members of society. Let's get rid of the income tax on that good thing, and let's shift that tax to the things that are bad, those things that are harmful. So there's certain ways that you can actually structure these these systems through policy and various financial mechanisms that kind of help make them work. But you have to be able to have that political conversation, and you've got a lot of entrenched mindsets. You've got a lot of people that, that they're not going to vote for it. And a lot of that is misinformation too. They fear something that they don't understand. And unfortunately, particularly in this country, it gets distorted. You talked about the partisan politics and the divisiveness. Everybody's living in their own sort of echo chambers right now, and they hear what they want to hear. That gets repeated and reinforced. So it's kind of hard to break down those walls.
So you're running for office when?
No.
This is the most riveting and I think critical part of the conversation for me, but we are at 6:25 and I don't know Joey has to be somewhere at 6:30. So I feel terrible being like, we should try to wrap this up, but we should try to find a place now, kind of close out this conversation. It's been incredible. And I don't know how to do that. Joey, you got a direction you want to be like, thanks for
I'm like, this is illuminating. Like, I don't know where to go from. Like, I think I've said this 2 or 3 times, like where to go from here, just because this is a topic that I'm so naive on. And I think a lot of people are. I don't speak for the masses, but there's so much to learn. There's so much to learn. And, I mean, this has just been, I just want to thank both of you for spending some time with us on a Friday afternoon or a Friday evening at that, spending an hour and a half to just share your hearts and share what you've been learning in your lives. And hopefully we can impact one individual from the conversation that we just had. Anything else on your head of your hearts that you want to share?
I'm excited for the future of nuclear fusion. That was a technology that I studied a little bit when I was in grad school, and we're on the way of nuclear fusion. I don't know if we'll develop it in time before we need energy shifts for the climate crisis, but I'm really excited about nuclear fusion, which is different than fission. It's this energy that's the sun. It's the way that sun generates energy, and we're working on it right now. Smart people are working on that, and they've got a demonstration plant in France. And at some point, they'll see if they can commercialize it. And I'm always excited about that idea, because to me, it would be a carbon neutral energy source for humanity going forward.
I haven't, it's been a long time since I had conversations about fusion, but am I dumb, or is that the byproducts aren't radioactive, are they?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, that's where you're
there's going to be some, but it's not like fission.
Nice. I it's been a long time since I researched into that. I didn't realize there had been developments. That's awesome.
That's super cool.
Yeah.
Any last words?
Yeah, I think I remain hopeful for human ingenuity, and I railed on technology a little bit earlier, but I mean, I think things like fusion on the horizon, or just so many of the different ways that we can tap into, harness the power of the sun. Stop living off of our banked natural capital, which is ancient sunlight, that's fossilized plant material, and start living off of current income, which is coming from the sun and wind.
Heliotropic effect.
Heliotropic?
Yeah.
What is this effect?
It's just living off of the energy that comes from, the energy that gives us light, the sun, the energy of the sun.
Exactly. So harnessing that, and, realizing that technology will help get us there, but realizing too that we need to alter human behavior as well. So we need to start to get comfortable with this concept of enough and living within boundaries. I would also say too, like, I've been teaching this stuff for a while now, and I learn something new every day. And I might walk into a classroom as the professor, but I'm learning from the kids in my class who are, 18, 19, 20-year-old kids. Every day I get a new perspective. I learn something new. It's like that ancient, I think it's a Greek saying that you can never step into the same river twice, because whenever you step into that river again, it's flowing. So it's a different part of the river and you're a different person. So just constantly being open to changing your mindset, taking in new information, and constantly realizing that you have to adjust your mental models, because we're talking about complex adaptive systems here. Nobody has the answers. I mean, we need to work globally. We need to work together to solve these problems, because they're systemic in nature. So keep an open mind, do your best to, applied hope, sustainability. So action being the antidote to apathy. Get out there and just do something, and realize that you can make a difference, one person, one step at a time.
If somebody wants to take one of your classes, or connect with either of you, further, where might they do that?
Yeah, for me, it's just Washington University in St. Louis Environmental Studies program, and it's all out there on the web. Yep.
The David
And for
wipe.
me, you can just find me on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Perfect. Lachlan, how about you?
I just work here, man. I don't know.
The voice of
Find
God.
me here.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, hey, Shelly, thank you so much for joining us. Shelly, coming in from Canada, incredible. Thank you so much for joining us virtually. Really appreciate your time. Dave, of course, as always, it's a pleasure and a privilege to talk to both of you. Lachlan, the producer from behind the scenes, the voice of God for the last 70 minutes. Amazing.
No, it's been incredible to be part of this conversation. This has been like super riveting and super important and super eye-opening in a lot of ways. So thank you both.
Hope everybody listening got something out of this. And gosh, what an incredible! I don't know how we're going to top this conversation. It's been absolutely. I said this a moment ago. It's been absolutely illuminating. Thank you both so much, everybody. Enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you next time on the Joey Talks podcast.